Thank you so much, Joseph. I have 101 questions for you, but I'm going to limit myself to one because then I want to hear everybody else's questions. I foresee some difficulty. I know financial regulators in developing countries. I've worked with quite a few in Africa and quite a few in Asia. I'm very concerned about their ability. I know the banks have the data. I know the banks are doing the work, and they're doing their KYC, and they're passing those suspicious transaction reports on to the regulator. That's where there's a problem. The regulator then is tasked with acting, and then is tasked with the further step of communicating that information to the police and ensuring that there is investigation and that there's actual action. So I know we should not discount that this process needs to occur and everybody needs to play their role, but what I'm wondering is there information that financial institutions, the macro level data that you referred to, can that be shared with civil society as well?
There's discussions in sharing that information with civil society. The privacy is a real, it's a necessary, I don't want to say necessary evil, but privacy is important. But it's very difficult to circumvent a lot of the privacy laws, especially in Canada and the United States, to actually get towards the ends means. When we started to contribute this intelligence to our FIU FinTrack, it's almost to the point where we said, don't do anything with it. Just keep it within your walls, and we'll go to law enforcement and we'll instruct them to come to you. So one of the feedback or actually criticisms that we had, and this was expressed by way of one of the world's oldest think tanks, RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute, when they came to speak to us last week in Toronto, they said, we heard that the RCMP was actually a little overwhelmed from Project Protect, and that it wasn't, they weren't fully prepared. And Peter Warwick, my superior, said, well, that's exactly why we did this. And we appreciate that the situation that they're in, but we put the focus on them which they had an empty officer seat for human trafficking at the federal level that was since been appointed as a result of Protect. But it's a matter of putting this information in there because that's part of the existing mandate, getting law enforcement to go, but then having the conversation with the federal regulator to say, okay, now you have all this information, what are you going to do about it? Putting the onus on them because they can't be the owners of all of this intelligence and then go forward and say, yes, human trafficking is very important to us and not have people question them. So I think it's about putting onus on the different groups. But once you offer up that intelligence, it becomes something that's accessible and can really contribute to, let's say, a municipal investigation that they were missing one piece towards their conviction. Now, I know I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but to come back to sharing with civil society, with NGOs, it's difficult. It's a conversation that we're having at a macro level because that's going to take time to change policy to allow them to have access to this information. But we are exchanging information at a more macro level with them by bringing them to the table, which was a little controversial to have the NGOs there. But I think it really gave different perspective to the members at that table in terms of hearing their perspective and having them go back to their groups and say, this is what we learned from a transactional financial side of things. So we're starting kind of high, but we're trying to dig deeper, but privacy is a big barrier for us.
Mr. Mayor, I want to congratulate you, and I want to say this in a general way about Canada. It's been spectacular in the reference of organ trafficking as a type of human trafficking. I want to agree with you. I'm coming to a question about these transaction reports as it would pertain to organ trafficking. The Palermo Protocol has been ineffective, just as you said. There are very few prosecutions in the world about organ trafficking when it requires fraud and deception, abduction, all those kinds of things. When it's a money transaction that is at the root of the organ trafficking. Canadians leave Canada elsewhere to buy organs. Can such a transaction report be required of a Canadian returning home? Just as when you fill out your immigration form, whatever, and you're coming home, you're going to, where have I been and what have I been up to? Can such a transaction report be considered for a Canadian that's departed for a transplant when they've gone to the Philippines or to India or they used to go to China, but other places in the world?
Thank you. That's, that wasn't within our initial scope, but it will be now going forward. And it can definitely be reported to FinTrack and within the existing mandate, because even so if a crime is not illegal in another country, in this case, it most likely is illegal in that country, but the similar crime would be reportable within the country where the person was returning. So if someone was to go off on a sex tourism visit with underage individuals or individuals underage within the country that they're leaving, you would be able to report that. So in this case, it's a little different, I think, across the world. I'm not too familiar with all the organ trafficking laws, but I would imagine that it's illegal around the world. So it'd definitely be reportable within our jurisdiction. And we could actually indicate at the top of that STR, that suspicious transaction report, for further reference to Interpol, Europol, whichever law enforcement agency was affected in the jurisdiction they're returning from.
Just, I'm going to follow come 30 seconds, not even. If this were to be realized, accomplished, this would be a major development model for all of the world as it pertains to the problems that we have. And so I'd like to connect you with the Canadian transplant leaders that would be quite receptive to this opportunity.
Please do, yes.
Thank you. Corbin, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for that presentation. I thought it was fantastic and something that really needs to be talked about more. So I just had two quick questions. One, in the US context, this has been something that has been the topic of a lot of conversation recently about how we can leverage financial institutions to, and regulations to combat trafficking. My first question is, so I've heard from folks in the US that it can be difficult for banks to sometimes distinguish when money laundering activity is specific to human trafficking versus other crimes. And so I was wondering if that was something that you've addressed. And then the second question is, I think when we're looking at trafficking networks, sometimes it's hard to figure out how do you get to the top of the chain. And, I think that tracking the money flow can be a way to get past the low, mid-level tier of a network. And so I was wondering if you guys are focusing on being able to track to get to the very top of trafficking networks.
Yes. So I'll address the first question first. We have to be, as a secular institution, we have to be very careful about the way we address human trafficking and then prostitution, or sex, the adult services, sex services, which I apologize if I'm offending anyone, but the legal component of, selling sex. The bank is very cautious of this, and we also don't want to inundate the FinTrack with all of this information that's not actually getting to the root of the problem that we want to solve, which is finding out who the traffickers are. So when we looked at we specifically said we are reporting on suspected traffickers or suspected individuals who are being trafficked. Now, I know the victims, we're not really supposed to report on them, but we report on them from the perspective that they are being affected by this. So not to accuse them, but to give the intelligence over, so hopefully if they're a missing person, that the information can be retrieved. What does this look like on the human trafficking side? We do have a formalized document that I can make available. It's actually referenced in the PDF version of my paper. But in this document, what we'll see is transactions that are seemingly innocuous combined together start to demonstrate what an individual is being trafficked look like. So if an individual is making their way down in Ontario, we have a highway called the 401. It's very readily used by traffickers. If you see a person that's their bank account or bank cards moving down this highway, that they're visiting pharmaceutical stores along the way, that they're visiting fast food stores along the way, that cash transactions happen in the middle of the night, that they go into a bank and that someone is instructing on behalf of them to the individual on the first line, the teller on the other side. So there's a man speaking on their behalf, even though it's their accounts. That an envelope that's received with cash inside of it has women's names on it at the first line by a teller. That ATMs within, let's say, a half-mile radius around the hotel district in Toronto or in the respective Canadian city that are being used between the hours of 1 and 5 a.m. When you start putting all of these things together, you now have a pretty unique individual that's doing things within a certain time band and traveling transient along certain routes. And now these are not demonstrated by normal Canadian, people that are banking, right? Like we all go have McDonald's, we all go to a pharmaceutical store, but when you put enough of these indicators together, you start to flesh out these individuals who are doing things that are suspicious enough, and our mandate, our threshold's very low, so we can report where we don't need beyond reasonable doubt the individuals that are doing this. And we had some really great success because it's a proactive approach, where historically before this, it was pretty much headline news, suspected trafficker arrested, let's bring up their account and see what they did. Now we're doing more than that. So that's for the first question. And for the second one, in terms of getting to the top of the chain, I think that's the idea here, is to try to find where the money goes. We all hear about the hundreds of billions of dollars, but when we start talking about it, it kind of gets pushed off to the side. I think it's really important that demand is a big issue, but also the incentive of why these people do this. And if we don't go after their money, and there's a detective, his name is Detective Sergeant Nunzio Tramontosi. He heads up the sex crimes unit in Toronto for the Toronto Police, the biggest municipal police force in Canada. And he pretty much firsthand says, when you throw them in jail in Canada, they don't really care because our laws are not that strict. They get out in a few years. If you take their car, if you take their house, if you take their assets, you will definitely discourage them because they have to start from zero all over again. And then this leads back to what Jamie asked before in terms of how do you pay reparations or pay back the individuals who these proceeds were derived from. And that's also part of our conversation, but it takes more time because it's much more complex in terms of what we first started with. But that is part of the conversation now, and that's where the NGOs are really coming in and trying to get this money back there and trying to share the information of who has the money with the police, with the NGOs. So it's the top of the chain of what we're going after. Yeah. Sure.
Hi, pleased to meet you. Soy de Argentina. Trabajé con una organización que se llama Contadores Forenses, intentando tener contacto con cómo hacer la ley de lavados de activos, porque como vos decías, como lo más importante para poder combatir las redes de narcotráfico, de crimen organizado, de trata de personas, de la prostitución, es fundamental ir a la fuente del dinero.
I apologize. It's very faint on the...
I try to do it in English, but I feel better if I explain in...
Now I can hear it. I can hear, yes. I can hear.
Sí. Y me gustaría, como saber si tienen un protocolo para compartir de este caso, porque en Argentina todavía no tenemos la ley de trabajo de activos, conocemos el trabajo de Libera, pero no cómo funcionan estos indicadores, que recién a él le comentabas un poquito, pudiendo explicar el ejemplo, pero me gustaría que dieras como más herramientas para ver cómo lo hicieron posible, porque nosotros lo intentamos, plantear el debate y no se pudo, porque no hubo el compromiso por parte ni de las fuerzas de seguridad ni del gobierno para poder tenerlo. Entonces, la primera pregunta es ¿cómo fueron esos indicadores? ¿Sí? Y si hay un protocolo para que lo puedan compartir, para poder socializarlo. Y la otra pregunta es, recién en lo que dijiste con la indemnización para las víctimas, ¿qué es lo que están elaborando? ¿Y quiénes son los actores que están interviniendo para poder hacerlo? Porque también como al trabajar con víctimas muchísimas veces, como hay una falta de, como explicaba Alicia, los refugios o las ONGs, no hay muchos fondos. Hay un fondito de una embajada o un proyectito muy chiquitito. Y uno tiene que trabajar en la reconstrucción de vida y en armar un proyecto de vida cuando acompaña a una víctima y en ese trabajo de empoderamiento. Entonces, el poder como conseguir el acompañamiento por parte de las instituciones financieras, que muchísimas veces reciben dineros que tienen contradicciones, porque Canadá, con The Barrick Gold, por ejemplo, en Argentina, con financiación que viene de la minería, tiene, o sea, como contaminación, entonces como genera determinadas contradicciones. Entonces, ¿cómo han hecho ustedes con eso? No sé si se entiende mi pregunta.
Okay. So for the first question, in terms of how you roll this out, the most important thing is setting up the public-private partnership. That's paramount. It doesn't have to be set up to address human trafficking. It has to be set up with the intention that we will now start sharing information to address public safety issues as representations of banks, law enforcement, government organizations. In the UK, they have a group called JMLIT, Joint Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Group. So this is a group, public-private, comes together, and they share information. And what's really interesting is they have a Rolodex, or a category of all contacts at all banks. So when a terrorist attack happens in, Trafalgar Square or something, they can pick up the phone and get all the banks in the middle of the night on the phone and say, start looking through your customer base and tell me who this is. We don't have that in Canada. What we have is Project Protect, and what we're using Project Protect to is to formalize those communication channels. So getting everyone on the same page and getting them to realize that they're not in competition with each other when it comes to terrorist financing, when it comes to human trafficking, is very important. Now, I know Canada is much different than, we'll use our neighbors, the United States. The United States is, there state-by-state laws and different regulatory, it's very difficult to coordinate across the US, and I know there's many groups that I'm aware, and probably that I'm not aware of, that are doing what we're doing, but with select partners. In Canada, we have the luxury of having 5 big banks, one regulator. Most things are regulated at either the federal level or just by 2 provinces, Quebec and Ontario. So it gives us the luxury of bringing this together, but it doesn't mean that, that the model won't work in other countries as well. And we're seeing the model in Australia being mimicked, and we're seeing the UK model being kind of modified to incorporate this less formal, but formal in terms of who the players are, public-private partnership. So that's what you need to set up first. Once you do that, then you can start building on top of that. And that's where you get out of the siloed approach and you start sharing data with one another to help. If I know how to identify human traffickers better than you, it's advantageous for me to tell you how to identify traffickers on your side, because we're both tasked with trying to do this for the greater good of society. For the second question, was it on, sorry, I lost my train, was it on the
compensation, but I think we can park the compensation question for the legal aid and the lawyer
because there is
panel.
something that we're looking into for that, for banks.
Yeah. Just one thing on the indicators, Joseph. I know the indicators are going to vary according to criminal behavior in each country, but I remember seeing an article, I believe it was by Deloitte and Touche, that talked about how to set your indicators. Do you know what I'm talking about?
How to set your indicators?
How the process of calibrating indicators,
yes.
Talking about geography of behavior, substance, and time frames.
Yeah, so you start off manually, and then what the ultimate goal and what we were the first to do in Canada, we created automated scenarios. We're all mandated, all banks are mandated to have automated transaction monitoring scenarios. These are computer programs that look for it. We've taken from our manual transactions that investigators were looking for to actually digitizing that and having that scanned through the entire customer base as opposed to individuals. So Deloitte
I think
can kind of
if there are resources that already exist on this would be helpful to circulate to people so they can carry forward that discussion with their own financial sector regulators and banks. And maybe it's an article that you'd like to write for us.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question coming
I
from
wanted to say that there are resources out of the United States. I heard a phenomenal presentation from a bank officer. I think the issue is complicity between banks and credit card companies. And in the US, there is a movement to hold credit card companies accountable for massive amounts of money that come through prostitution venues, strip clubs, escort agencies that are laundered. And if you say who I should pass it on to, Margaret, should I send it to you? She gave me permission to pass on her presentation, which is a series of steps. Bank officers are, in her particular bank, which I can't remember the name of right now. But in this bank, all banks were required to monitor the kinds of transactions you're describing. It's not complicated if you're a banker or if you work for credit cards company.
I'd like to see that, please, if you, later on, if we can connect and you can send me that presentation. Yeah.
Thank you. Shanta, you had a question, then we're going to move to the lawyer panel.
I think that's on. Thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting. I just had two questions, really. One was, given that about 68%, according to the statistics, about 68% of victims of modern slavery are exploited for labour, so labour exploitation, and not necessarily in sex work. To what extent is Project Protect also trying to capture trafficking or victims of modern slavery in the labour exploitation area? And if so, what are the types of indicators that you would look for that would distinguish modern slavery in terms of labour exploitation from other forms of money laundering? And my second question was, has there been a tangible example of how this increase in reporting and focus by the banks has led to a prosecution?
Mm-hmm. So with respect to forced labor, when we were scoping this out, we really took it in chunks. So the first chunk was trafficking for the purpose of sex, and we discussed with the Toronto Police and with a few different law enforcement agencies the impact of forced labor in Canada. From their perspective, it wasn't anywhere near the scale of trafficking for the purpose of sex work. So we decided to focus in on the sex work side of things. Now, the fact that they said it wasn't at the scale, maybe it's because they don't have a Project Protect. That's how. So that's in addition to the trafficking of organs. This is something that we'll look into. We've noted a few cases in Canada, but it's not something that is really at the same level right now in terms of focus. But that doesn't mean that we won't refocus our efforts towards addressing it. But I don't really have many examples for you because this project was predominantly focused on trafficking for the purpose of sex work. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, just in terms of the work that has been done, in terms of focusing very much on exploitation for prostitution, has there been a prosecution as a result of the information that has been shared?
Yes, there has. So prior, I believe there was only one conviction in Canada prior to Project Protect under the new one of the new human trafficking laws that was put forward. And what we're seeing now is feedback. So the way it works in Canada is when we disseminate this information, it goes one way. So we send it to the FIU sends it to law enforcement, and we never hear about it ever again unless we read a newspaper and we try to coincidentally piece it all together. But we do hear back from time to time informally from law enforcement agencies that they managed to get not only charges laid, but a conviction by way of the STRs that were provided to them. So that's really, it really kind of brings things full circle down, but we're getting more charges now, but the convictions are difficult to get, and that's, I guess, another kind of story because of how difficult it is to get the victims to actually testify against their traffickers in certain cases as well within Canada, within our circumstance. But we are seeing this translate or parlay into actual convictions in court, whereas before that was a real big driving force of this, that we weren't even seeing any brought before the Crowns, just because there was a lack of knowledge in terms of how to piece this all together.
One last question.
Ahora sí. Bueno, primeramente buen día. Dos cositas. Un comentario primeramente de que en Bolivia, por ejemplo, tenemos una ley de bancos donde establece que la responsabilidad social...
I apologize to interrupt. The translator is not... Okay,
¿Sí? Ya. Les decía que en Bolivia tenemos una ley, que es la ley de los bancos, donde la responsabilidad social de esto está dirigida a 3 temas: violencia, niñez y personas de la tercera edad. Pero como siempre, echa la ley, echa la trampa, nosotros decimos. Porque ¿qué sucede? Sucede que los mismos bancos y entidades financieras están creando sus propias organizaciones y fundaciones. Entonces se van dirigidos todos estos fondos a lo que ellos les parece, porque prácticamente ellos crean su proyecto y va direccionado a esto. Segundo, en este grado de complicidad que hablaba Melissa, también tenemos un grado de autoría del sistema financiero que esconde muchas veces todos estos tipos de transacciones. En Bolivia tenemos una figura que se llama legitimación de ganancias ilícitas. Pero ¿qué es lo que sucede? Nunca se ha podido enjuiciar a un proxeneta. ¿Por qué? Porque ellos no son las personas que realizan este lavado de dinero, sino es a través de palos blancos, lo que llamamos. ¿A quién? A la persona más humilde, es que convencen para hacer estos tipos de transacciones y son a estas personas que las que terminan en prisión, ¿no? Pero nunca jamás se ha sabido de un proxeneta que maneje sus cuentas fácilmente. Y que cada vez se están creando situaciones alternativas para evitar el proceso de los bancos. Por ejemplo, tenemos una figura que se llama Tigo Money. ¿Qué es un Tigo Money? Que yo en cualquier localidad, en cualquier municipio, en cualquier puesto de venta, puedo ir, realizo una transacción, pago de 1.000 bolivianos 100, un 10%, un 5%, y al otro lado lo cobran sin ninguna pregunta, más que el carnet de identidad y un número telefónico de referencia. Entonces se van creando situaciones alternativas y no hay una reglamentación que pueda regular esta figura, porque como todo lo que no está prohibido está permitido, entonces son situaciones que se van creando sin que haya una reglamentación establecida. Gracias.
So in terms of the fund, I'm not familiar with any funds in Canada, but what I will say is that, and don't hold me to this because it's not confirmed yet, but what we're looking at is the credit products, which was previously mentioned as well, the credit products that are being used by the traffickers that are in the names of the trafficked individuals. What we find is that the credit scores are destroyed for the trafficked individuals after the fact, and they usually have outstanding balances. So we're looking for a small win again and getting the financial institutions to say, could we forgive the outstanding credit on the card and to help them start working, or either start from zero or working towards expedited repairing of their credit score. So they're not, once, let's say they were to be liberated from their captors put in jail, how do we contribute and help them start to reintegrate in a financial sense to society? Because I think that has to be a component. There's a psychological reintegration, there's many different components, but I would imagine that the financial reintegration is probably one that's not really discussed and maybe not really valued at in terms of the other forms of reintegration, but I think it should be on the table as well. And with these little wins of repairing the credit score, forgiving the debt, that's something that is being discussed now because it's something that could actually happen. It's every country is different in terms of how to approach this. Some countries meet this with hostility and just outright deny the fact that human trafficking exists within their borders for one reason or another. But the NGOs are sometimes left really bearing the brunt of this cause, and you need a champion. You need someone that you can kind of latch onto that has influence that can make a difference for you. Because sometimes when you go through the traditional channels, as I said before, you're met with roadblocks that are there because there's many other people that are asking for help us end. In Canada right now, the big focus is help us end fentanyl. In fentanyl use, opioid use. That's something that's really taking center stage, but these things just keep adding up one after another. So what we found is that when you start small, you sometimes have this kind of snowball effect that helps you, address bigger issues one step at a time. Because we're here today talking about human trafficking, but there's people around the world that are probably talking about opioid use and organ trafficking and underage children being used for child pornography. That I know is kind of related, but there's many different noble causes that are going on. So we need to be precise in what we ask for. And I agree with Father Behi what he said before. And my kind of motto, and I love to read, I love to write, but no one reads. No one reads anything. They just look for a few bullet points and they go with that. And I know that's a generalization, but what I found in life is when you give less and you give more precise, your feedback is a lot more. You actually made the reader feel a lot better because they read 2 points on a page and they understood what they were reading, as opposed to giving them a 50-page document. So I think that that should be our real driving force here, and it should be our motto when we go back, or our modus operandi when we go back to our respective countries, to say, let's not convolute this. Let's not put too many issues on the table at one time. Let's not talk about poverty, legal prostitution, a lot of these socioeconomic issues that we all are affected in all our respective countries. If we want to talk trafficking, let's just go in with trafficking right away. And then, not to say that we should abandon those other causes, but let's continue that discussion and use the wins that we have to give more support towards the larger issues. So if we could kind of divide down this, like the middle here when we discuss our recommendations, I would say we all think about 3 recommendations that are tangible within our spheres of influence, and 3 recommendations that are longer term that we will use the small wins to help us achieve the larger wins, or at least help the conversation continue when we're trying to end poverty and when we're trying to address legal prostitution. We'll use the small wins towards bigger victories.
Thank you. I think this is a topic we could keep talking about for days because it's fascinating, it's new, and we're connecting new sectors that need to be connected. But I would just encourage you all to keep in contact with Joseph and with the Bank of Montreal and keep sharing information. And we'll keep Joseph busy until retirement years. So now we're going to move on to the legal compensation issue, which is definitely very tied to Mr. Mari's presentation. And I think I have all my advocates grouped here, center stage, so fantastic. I think there's general agreement that victims of human trafficking are owed compensation as both a remedy and a form of restorative justice. Various jurisdictions, however, approach the issue differently. Some jurisdictions allow for funds to be awarded as part of criminal prosecutions of the trafficker. Some states, it's possible to bring civil legal actions. For example, alleging labor law violations against traffickers and seeking an award of damages based on such claim. Generally speaking, the legal framework in most countries allows for more than one option to obtain compensation. But it's very difficult for a victim of trafficking to navigate the legal system. How does the victim become aware of the various paths towards justice? How does the victim navigate the administrative and judicial procedures in a foreign land, if that's the case, and frequently without the benefit of legal counsel? This panel will explore this quandary. Hopefully we'll come up with some substantive answers and good examples from different jurisdictions. And we're emphasizing the role of the lawyers here, in particular from the private sector, because there's a strong culture of public interest advocacy amongst lawyers. And I generalize because I'm not talking only about lawyers, but I'm focusing on them. We do have advocates, for example, who are not lawyers. Sometimes the advocate does a much better job, understands the holistic framework and the issues better than a lawyer. So I don't want to minimize the role of advocates. They're also important. It's an issue also amongst the legal profession that elicits very intense feelings and a commensurate desire to use one's legal background and one's legal knowledge for good. Generally, if you ask most young lawyers and even older lawyers in their career and later in their profession, they went to law school to create social change and to create positive impact in the world. So today we're going to be talking about these issues, and we have a really interesting array of perspectives because we have advocates and lawyers from different jurisdictions. Starting with Ms. Stella Odife, who is the founder of Women's Organization for Gender Issues from Nigeria. Stella is also an advocate and I would say dedicated her career to women's rights issues, and in particular widows' rights issues in Africa. Seated next to Ms. Odife is Alberto Mosino, who comes to us from PM Anlus in Torino. Mr. Mosino founded an organization that I believe probably started small and started sheltering and helping 1 or 2 women to recover from trafficking. And he's found over his career of 15 plus years, 20 years, that the activities are continuing to expand and to expand. And also now I believe you're doing legal aid and legal assistance for victims of trafficking. We go up a row. Ms. Shanta Martin is a partner at Lee Day, Lee Day has taken on a very interesting case that we'll hear more about from Ms. Martin, which was the very first labor law trafficking case under the new Modern Slavery Act. So we'll hear more about that from Ms. Martin. Directly behind Ms. Martin, we have Grégoire Théry, and we've heard quite a lot about his advocacy, and we'll hear more about the changes in the French legal system and how that has had an impact on the victims of trafficking. And right to the left of my right, Ms. Marta Torres Herrero, who comes to us from the Shellis Foundation, who's a Spanish lawyer. So we have a Spanish lawyer, a French lawyer, a UK lawyer, a Nigerian lawyer, and an Italian advocate. So I hope we'll have a very fruitful cross-cultural and cross-legal sector conversation. The first question that I want to pose to you all is, after listening to Mr. Mari's presentation on the financial sector, do you have some thoughts with regard to how you can utilize this in your legal strategies to obtain compensation? So let's start with Stella.